Hello Tom, thank you for meeting with me today. My first question is obviously the European elections have shown just how split the Remain vote was. In your opinion, do you think that the Lib Dems could be the party to lead the Remain movement?
Well, I would challenge you when you say the Remain vote was split. I think what would be fair to say is that the vote in terms of Remain or Leave was very heavily split. And I think that's why we ended up with a position where the Brexit Party did very well, and also the Liberal Democrats, with the Greens doing better than perhaps they've done in past elections. So yes, I think that what happened during that campaign was that the Liberal Democrats, because of the very clear position that we've adopted and our policy offer, which summarises bollocks to Brexit, is something that people who were strong Remainers, whether they're in the Liberal Democrats, Conservative Party, there are some in the Conservative Party, Green Party, Plaid in Wales and so on, or the Labour Party, identified us as being the party that was speaking the loudest for them and also had the best chance of actually winning. And that's why we did as well as we did.
Following on from that then, your new leader, Jo Swinson, said that she was a viable candidate to be Prime Minister, especially now that the Brexit vote is so split and that the Conservatives did rather badly in the European elections, as you say. After 2010, obviously, as you know, the calamitous downfall after Nick Clegg's coalition with the Conservative Party, do you think that the Lib Dems are a viable party for government?
Well, in the European elections, which you've just referred to, we polled the second largest number of votes in the country. And in fact, where we're sitting here, London voted Liberal Democrat. More people voted Liberal Democrat in the European elections than for any other political party. So clearly there is a large number of people out there who are now willing to back the Liberal Democrats, and that's why the opinion polls put the four parties, Brexit, Conservative, Labour and Lib Dems, roughly on the same sort of level of support. And that means that come a general election, and one could be upon us literally in a matter of weeks, come a general election, it's everything to play for, and the idea that Jo Swinson could be our future Prime Minister is something that is a perfectly rational position to set out.
Do you think, though, that the Liberal Democrats undoubtedly rise to prominence now? Can you really only attribute that to Brexit? Do you think if Brexit hadn't have happened, the Lib Dems wouldn't be in the position that they are now?
Well, I think your analysis is correct, that if Brexit hadn't happened, it wasn't clear how quickly as a party we could recover from the 2015 election and the subsequent one in 2017, which were frankly not very good for the party. So I think Brexit did two things. First of all, Brexit to some extent wiped the slate clean of anything that had come before Brexit, in terms of any policy advocated by any party, in terms of anything that past governments had done. All of a sudden in 2016, Brexit cleared the decks of any other policy issues and people started to focus on Brexit to the exclusion of anything else. So I think for us as a party, 3 years ago, that Brexit vote happened at a time when there was a real threat to the Liberal Democrats about whether we were going to continue as a party at all, a real existential threat to us when we had just 8 members of Parliament. That Brexit vote gave us all of a sudden an issue on which we had a very clear position which appealed to a much more substantial number of people than had voted Liberal Democrat in the 2015 elections, and has helped us. I think what your question, however, is clearly highlighting is that at the point that Brexit is resolved, whether that is by miraculously our new Prime Minister Boris Johnson either securing a new deal, which I think is incredibly unlikely, or by him ramming through no deal, which I think is also unlikely because Parliament has said absolutely no to that, that we will be in a position where as a party, so if Brexit is resolved by it being delivered, or alternatively, if Brexit is resolved by actually cancelling Brexit, which is what we would like to do, then as a party, clearly at that point, we have to speak more loudly about the other policy offers that we've got, because we can't afford to be a one policy party.
Obviously, moving on to the partisan debate about whether to cancel continue Brexit. Why is it, in your personal opinion, that we should cancel Brexit? And do you not feel some semblance of guilt that you could be betraying the 17.4 million people that voted for it?
Well, clearly the vote 3 years ago was won. I mean, the people who voted to leave the European Union won. I would highlight, however, that there was a very deliberate, successful attempt to exclude from participation in that referendum the two groups of people, or possibly the three groups of people, who are going to be most affected by it. EU citizens in the UK, of whom there were 3 million, UK citizens in the EU who had lived in EU countries for more than 15 years, who were also not allowed to vote in the election, but potentially 16 and 17-year-olds who are going to have to live with that, the consequences of Brexit, for far longer than anyone else. They were deliberately excluded from taking part in the referendum. So the will of the people, yes, was expressed by a subset of the will of the people, but one that deliberately excluded those who were most likely to support us staying in the EU. What has also happened, of course, is that that vote took place more than 3 years ago, and the view that might have been expressed then, it's entirely possible that the view might be different now. And just as we have general elections, I mean, we had a general election that took place 2 years after the 2015 election, we had one in 2017. Lots of the promises that were made by the government in 2015 had not been delivered by 2017. The slate was wiped clean, a new manifesto was put forward, and lots of the things that had been proposed 2 years before had been abandoned, presumably because at that point the public were voting for something different and didn't want what had been on offer in the manifesto in 2015. And so I would argue that something that took place 3 years ago, it is legitimate to ask people to confirm whether now what is being offered to them is what they want. And I think it is even more legitimate to put that question if, as seems likely, Boris Johnson, our new Prime Minister, is going to attempt to ram through no deal, because neither he nor Nigel Farage nor any of the other leading Brexit campaigners 3 years ago were saying to the British public, if you vote for Brexit, what you're going to get is leaving the European Union without a deal. They were, all of them, to a man and woman, saying we would get a fantastic deal with the European Union that gave us exactly the same rights as we had now, but without any of the responsibilities.
You gave obviously an impassioned case as to why Brexit was wrong, and why the people should have a chance to reaffirm whether they think Brexit is right. But surely the result of the Brexit Party in the European election kind of suggests that the people have already made their voice heard. Otherwise, Nigel Farage's Brexit Party wouldn't have secured such a large lead.
You're right. Clearly, there is a significant percentage of people who now are in effect setting aside what happened 3 years ago in terms of the referendum campaign, when nobody was saying we're going to get no deal, and that's brilliant for the United Kingdom, because people know actually it's a disaster, who now have moved on to saying, well, actually, we want no deal at all, and we're quite happy, for instance, to see 40% tariffs applied to Welsh lamb when it goes into the German market, meaning that all of the Welsh hill farmers are going to be put out of business. So I would challenge the legitimacy of what they are saying now. And if I could remember your question, I would complete my answer to it. But
no, all I was saying is that obviously you've said that Brexit is wrong.
Yeah.
If that was the case, surely large swathes of people wouldn't have voted for Nigel Farage's Brexit Party and made them the largest UK party in the European Parliament.
Absolutely. So you're right. A substantial chunk of people did vote for the Brexit Party, and but if you actually add up the number of people who voted for parties that would be identified as being Remain parties, Liberal Democrats, Green Party, Plaid and SNP in Wales and Scotland, actually, I think most pollsters agree that it was actually a lead for the Remain voting parties in the European referendum, or European election, sorry, not for the Brexit supporting parties.
Now, your new leader, Jo Swinson, has just recently, in the last 2 hours, come out and said that she wouldn't work with the Labour Party. to secure like the stopping Brexit
or
the
the Conservative Party.
or the Conservative Party. Surely, if you're wanting to heal the divisions in the country, the best thing to do is to unite with the Remain supporting parties, or is it because Labour has not completely clarified its position on unambiguously supporting Remain?
I mean, clearly what Jo has set out, and I'm in full agreement with her on this, Boris Johnson is the man who is advocating no deal and says do or die by the 31st of October. Jeremy Corbyn is a long-standing Brexiteer who, in my view, he and the people around him have, over the last couple of years, ducked and dived, fudged and weaved on the issue of Brexit, leaving his own party spokespeople in a very difficult position when, for instance, on television, they have to try and explain what their party policy on Brexit is. So I'm afraid I do not believe that Jeremy Corbyn has changed the views that he has held for the last 30 years, which he wants out of the European Union. And he and the people around him have this idea that the best way of achieving perhaps a socialist revolution in the country is to get Brexit and for it to be a disaster, whereupon the people will suddenly, it's good Marxist sort of philosophy, people suddenly turn to his party as the saviour, but he will have contributed to what I think would be a catastrophe for the United Kingdom. So we are absolutely not going to be backing him. But just to finish, what we would be much more happy to do is to work, as we are already doing, cross-party with a number of MPs from the Conservative Party, a much larger number of MPs from the Labour Party, from Plaid, from the SNP, from Change UK, from the Independents, where we are working together to, for instance, block no deal. And that perhaps provides an opportunity in the future to create a wider grouping of members of Parliament who actually see the future of the United Kingdom very different from the one that's advocated by Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, a future for the UK which I would describe for them as being a nationalist and highly populist future for the United Kingdom. We want a liberal future for the United Kingdom, and that is something on which I think members of other parties would be willing to support us.
Boris Johnson, now he has been elected as Prime Minister, he'll be entering a government that has a slim majority. Are you confident that, as you've said, by working on a cross-party basis, that you would be able to grind to a halt his plans to leave the European Union with no deal?
What's the position for Boris Johnson has just become, I think, in many respects, harder than the position that Theresa May was in, because first of all, it is likely, it's not certain, but it's quite possible that on the 1st of August that he will lose another seat, that the Liberal Democrats, we will gain the Brecon and Radnorshire seat, in which case his majority drops to just a couple of MPs. We've had a number of Conservative ministers who have resigned in the last couple of days, who have said that over their dead bodies will they support a no deal as proposed by Boris Johnson. And these are not insignificant players, people like our Chancellor, for instance, and David Gauke, Alan Duncan, Alistair Burt, Margot James, people who've got ministerial experience, who are now, I hope, in a position where, released from the cabinet or ministerial positions, where they will be willing to join forces with me and MPs in other parties, not just to stop no deal, but a number of them I know would also favour the idea of a people's vote, and that could make that more likely as well.
Do you think, talking about a people's vote, do you think there's actually going to be a second referendum? I mean, you've been campaigning now for over 2 years, and obviously Theresa May's government has been completely opposed to the idea of a second referendum. How do you think that, with a man now entering 10 Downing Street who is completely determined to withdraw from the European Union irregardless of the impacts on the UK, how are you going to achieve getting the people's vote?
Indeed. Well, Boris Johnson, and it's not me saying this, these are comments made by his own Conservative colleagues, is someone who can happily say one thing today and the opposite tomorrow. And Boris Johnson may well have said to Conservative Party members, who after all are the only people who have just elected our Prime Minister, no one else has done so, and they represent one out of 400 people in the country as a Conservative Party member. Boris Johnson may find very soon that he knows Parliament will block no deal. And a number of his ex-ministers have said they would be prepared to bring down the government, his government, if he tries to ram through no deal. So that's not an option. The idea that between now and the 31st of October he will get another deal from the European Union is for the birds. It's not going to happen. They are not going to reopen the withdrawal agreement. What they might do is tweak the political declaration, put some more flowery words around it, but I think that will not convince the ERG members within the Conservative Party that he's done the job in relation to Brexit. So no deal is not an option. New deal isn't an option. General election is very risky because if he has not delivered Brexit, then I can't see Nigel Farage saying, oh, well, that's fine. I will fold my party, let the Conservative Party run a general election campaign with no Brexit candidate standing. On the contrary, Nigel Farage is likely to say, well, you didn't deliver Brexit, my turn now. He will stand candidates in the election. And the outcome of that is likely to be the pro-Brexit vote gets split between the Conservative Party and the Brexit Party and helps people like me. So Boris Johnson may, by a process of elimination, end up with the conclusion that the only thing that he can now do is put to the people the Prime Minister's deal, not his, Theresa May's deal, possibly with some extra words around it, and put it to a people's vote, because he, in those circumstances, what he will get from us, the Liberal Democrats, and a number of MPs in other parties, is our acquiescence to allowing him to put that a deal to the country, but subject to a people's vote. So then if the people think that Theresa May's deal, as amended by Boris Johnson, is exactly the thing that they wanted, and that is, after all, the only thing that's available, that they can vote for that, or if, with hindsight, they think, as I do, that the last 3 years has been a complete distraction from the country's real problems and has cost us billions of pounds, which it has, and they'd like to put a lid on this and forget all about it, they'd have the option to vote to remain.
But is Remain going to appear on the ballot? Because, of course, you can only have two options outlined by the Electoral Commission.
You could have more options, and I think even the Electoral Commission would allow that to happen. There's a question about whether, once you start having more than two options, whether anyone will feel that the outcome of it is genuine and hasn't been, in some ways, rigged in favour of one option versus another. I mean, there are a number of ways in which you could, for instance, have an option that said, an opening question that said, do you want to remain or do you want to leave? And then if a majority of people voted to leave, you could then have a subsequent question, which would, do you want to leave with Theresa May's deal or do you want to leave with no deal? So there are a number of ways in which you could have more than one question put to the population. But I think the difficulty for me of having anything other than Theresa May's deal, which has been agreed by the European Union, we know exactly what it means, versus Remain on the ballot paper, having anything different, including no deal, which first of all, the government's own analysis says is going to be catastrophic for the United Kingdom in terms of loss of jobs, shrinking our GDP and so on, wasn't something that was on the ballot paper, although I suppose we're putting it afresh on the ballot paper, so it has some legitimacy, but is in itself no deal. Even having no deal on the ballot paper, no one actually really knows what no deal constitutes, because it's quite clear that if the government knew that there was going to be a people's vote where the choice was between no deal and Remain, what the government would then try and do is very quickly they would try to pass any number of sort of more minor bilateral agreements with France, Germany, perhaps with the European Union if they're able to. So even no deal is not, it's not possible to define that very clearly. So I think that's why we favour the idea of Theresa May's deal, a document like that sets out what the consequences are, or Remain, and we know what Remain means. It was confirmed in a legal case that I was involved with that Remain means we stay in the European Union on exactly the same terms as we have now. We don't contribute more, we don't have to join the euro, we don't have to join Schengen, we don't lose any of the opt-outs that we had. We stay in the European Union as if the nightmare that happened 3 years ago hadn't actually happened.
What would be worse for you, putting a scenario on this topic? What would be worse, leaving the European Union with no deal or leaving the European Union with Theresa May, also known as Boris's amended deal, if that were put to a vote?
If that were put to a vote, it would have to be Theresa May's deal, because the government's analysis of the impact of no deal Brexit versus a Canada Brexit versus at one point Michael Gove suggested we should be like Albania, so an Albania Brexit. The worst in terms of the economic impact is no deal. The other variations are slightly less damaging, and therefore it would have to be Theresa May's deal as amended by whatever Boris Johnson had dreamt up in his summer holidays.
Now, tapping into your parliamentary experience, I want to ask you, do you think that Brexit has broken British politics?
Well, what Brexit has done is, first of all, it has broken the two-party duopoly. We now see roughly all of the political parties on about the same thing in percentage terms. So the outcome of a future general election will be highly unpredictable, given that seats are going to be won. A lot of them will be 3 or 4 in Scotland, 5-way splits, and that makes it very hard to predict what the outcome is going to be. It's certainly done it from that point of view. But I think what it's also done is it has split the country in a way that I have not seen before. Now, I suppose the clearest example where perhaps it did the same thing was in relation to the Iraq War in 2003, where clearly you would have had families, for instance, where some of the family members were fully behind the war and others were completely opposed, where that might have created a split in a particular family. But the Brexit vote, what that has done is, first of all, it has created to a great extent a north, southeast stroke London split. It has generated a split between Scotland and England, not so between Wales and England, because Wales voted to leave. A split between Northern Ireland and England, because Northern Ireland voted to stay, and a split between the Northern Ireland people and the Northern Ireland politicians, because most of the politicians, DUP, support leaving, whereas the population of Northern Ireland voted to remain. It has created a split between generations, where young people are unhappy with the way their parents or grandparents voted, and it has created a split between people who are perhaps more affluent, more highly educated, and those who are less affluent without perhaps degrees and so on. So that is something that I have not seen before, even in the past with political parties where perhaps, say Margaret Thatcher, some would argue polarised the country, even in relation to things like affluent people versus people who are less affluent. She managed to attract people from different parts of the financial spectrum, if I can put it that way. Brexit has managed to split the country top, bottom, left, right, age, gender. It's done it.
Finally, now, I know obviously turkeys don't vote for Christmas and Boris Johnson is largely unpopular with the mass electorate. But if there were a general election in, say, the next 6 months that Boris Johnson had called, what do you think the outcome would be? Could you see perhaps a coalition? Would you be willing to form a coalition with the Labour Party?
No, I mean, it is very, very unlikely that we would form a coalition with anyone. The Liberal Democrat experience, as you'll know, of coalitions was not entirely happy one. And as long as Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn remain the leaders of their respective parties, there's no possibility whatsoever of doing any sort of deal with them at all. I mean, you say a general election within the next 6 months. We're planning on the basis that general election will be in October, so in just over a couple of months' time. And what is possible is that, particularly if Boris Johnson does some sort of deal with Nigel Farage, it might not be a formal one, it might be an informal one where there's an agreement that in certain parts of the country perhaps the Brexit Party won't stand candidates, they'll give the Conservatives a free run. Perhaps in other parts of the country, probably there'll be less of them, the Brexit Party will stand and the Conservatives won't. That in that sort of scenario, then it may well be that the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, Plaid, SNP, Change UK, Labour, I think is very unlikely because I doubt their position will have changed in relation to Brexit, will look at, is there an arrangement whereby, which happened in the 2017 general election, The Liberal Democrats, we did not stand a candidate against Caroline Lucas in her seat, the one Green Member of Parliament, where they would reciprocate in different parts of the country where it was very clear who was best placed to defeat a pro-Brexit candidate. And as I said, that is much more likely in a scenario where the Conservatives do some sort of backroom deal with the Brexit Party.
Tom Brake, thank you very much for meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.